The bitter Montana wind cut through the train yard like a knife through butter, as Florence Keller clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her trunk sitting forlornly beside her on the wooden platform. The December sky hung heavy with the promise of more snow as she checked her pocket watch for the 20th time. 6 hours she had been waiting, with no sign of the man who had promised to make her his wife. Florence exhaled, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air of Whitefish, Montana. The year was 1885, and she had traveled all the way from Boston on the promise of marriage to a cattle rancher named Walter Green. 3 months of correspondence had led to this moment, or rather, should have led to a different moment entirely. One where she was greeted warmly, not left abandoned at a desolate train station as night approached. "Miss, station's closing soon." The station master's voice carried a note of concern as he approached, lantern swinging in his gnarled hand. "Can't have you waiting out here all night." "Temperature's dropping something fierce. He'll be here," Florence insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Green must have been delayed by the weather." The station master's weathered face creased with sympathy. "Walter Green, from over Elk Valley way." Florence nodded, hope flickering briefly. "Miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but word came through last week. Walter Green passed on. Influenza took him quick-like." The blood drained from Florence's face. Dead. The man whose letters had promised her a new life was dead, and no one had thought to inform her. Her legs trembled beneath her as the reality of her situation crashed down. 23 years old, nearly 2,000 miles from home, with barely enough money for a week's lodging. I didn't know," she stammered. "Figured as much when I saw you waiting." The station master shifted uncomfortably. "Town's Inn is full up with the cattle buyers in from Chicago, but my wife might have a spare room if— I'll handle this, Jim." A deep voice cut through their conversation. Florence turned to see a tall figure approaching through the swirling snow. He moved with the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin, his broad shoulders squared against the wind. As he came closer, the station master's lantern illuminated his features, a strong jawline shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Marshall Rowland." The station master nodded respectfully. "This young lady's been waiting since noon for Walter Green." "I heard." The man's gaze settled on Florence, assessing but not unkind. "News travels slow sometimes. I'm sorry you weren't informed, madam." Florence straightened her spine, determined not to collapse into tears. "It seems I've made a terribly long journey for nothing." Marshall Rowland studied her for a long moment before removing his gloved hand from his pocket and extending it toward her. "You're not forgotten, miss. Not while I'm sheriff of this county." Florence stared at his outstretched hand, then placed her cold fingers in his warm grasp. Something in his steady gaze made her believe him. "My sister runs the boarding house just past the church," Marshall continued. "She'll have room for you tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out your next steps." "I couldn't possibly impose. It's no imposition." His voice was firm but gentle. "No one gets left out in the cold in my town." As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind swept across the platform, carrying stinging pellets of snow. Florence shivered violently. "Jim, would you mind telling Harriet at the telegraph office to expect me in the morning?" Marshall asked the station master. "Miss Keller might want to send word back east about her situation." The station master nodded and headed back toward the station building. Marshall released her hand only to pick up her trunk with ease. "It's a short walk to Abigail's place." "You think you can manage in those shoes?" Florence glanced down at her city boots, already soaked through from the snow. "I'll manage." He assessed her again, then shrugged out of his heavy wool coat. "Take this." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he said firmly. draping it over her shoulders before she could protest further. The coat enveloped her in warmth that smelled of pine and leather. "I've got layers and I'm used to this weather. You're not." As they walked through the snow-covered streets of Whitefish, Florence felt the stares of the few people still out in the evening. A woman in a costly Eastern dress walking beside the sheriff was bound to cause talk. "I should explain," she said quietly. "I'm a mail-order bride." "Or I was supposed to be. I figured as much." Marshall's expression remained neutral. "Walter placed an advertisement in the Eastern papers last summer. He was a good man. You knew him well. Everyone knows everyone in a town this size. He had a decent spread about 5 miles out. Been building it up for years." Marshall paused, then added, "No family to speak of, which is why I reckon no one thought to write to you." Florence swallowed hard. "And now I'm here with nowhere to go and a return ticket I can't afford." They stopped in front of a neat 2-story house with warm light glowing from the windows. Marshall set down her trunk and turned to face her. "Miss Keller, I won't pretend to know what you're feeling right now, but I want you to understand something. This town takes care of its own, and tonight that includes you." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since receiving the news. "Thank you, Sheriff Rowland." "Marshall," he corrected. "Just Marshall." The door of the boarding house opened before they could knock, revealing a plump woman with graying hair twisted into a bun. Her eyes, the same storm gray as Marshall's, widened at the sight of them. "Marshall Rowland, you bring that poor girl inside this instant," she exclaimed, ushering them in with flapping hands. "Jim's boy ran over to tell me what happened. Oh, you poor dear, you must be frozen solid." Within minutes, Florence found herself seated before a crackling fire, a cup of hot tea in her hands and a woolen blanket around her shoulders. Abigail Rowland bustled around, instructing her brother to take Florence's trunk to the room at the top of the stairs while she prepared a late supper. "You'll stay as long as you need," Abigail informed her. "And don't you worry about payment just yet." "You're very kind, Miss Rowland," she corrected with a smile. "Never did find a man worth the trouble of changing my name, but you can call me Abigail." Florence managed a small smile in return. "I appreciate your hospitality, Abigail. I promise I won't be a burden for long." Marshall returned downstairs and settled into a chair across from her. "Town's small, but we might find you work if you're willing. What skills do you have?" Florence straightened her shoulders. "I was a school teacher in Boston for 2 years. I also play the piano, speak passable French, and can manage basic bookkeeping." Something flickered in Marshall's eyes. "Is that so? Our school teacher, Mrs. Palmer, has been wanting to retire for years. Her arthritis is getting worse, especially in this cold." Hope flickered in Florence's chest. "Do you think the town would consider me for the position?" "I don't see why not if you have the qualifications." Marshall leaned back in his chair. "Town council meets on Tuesday. I can put your name forward. I would be most grateful." Florence hesitated, then asked, "May I ask why you're helping me?" "You don't know anything about me." Marshall's expression softened slightly. "My mother came west as a mail-order bride. Father died before I was 10. If not for the kindness of neighbors, we wouldn't have survived." He glanced toward the kitchen where Abigail was busy preparing food. "I know what it's like to feel forgotten by the world. No one deserves that." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the fresh snow sparkling in the sunlight. Florence woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen. After dressing in her second-best dress, saving her best for the town council meeting, she descended to find Abigail alone in the kitchen. "Marshall had to ride out early," Abigail explained, placing a generous plate before Florence. "Rancher reported missing cattle, but he asked me to take you around town today, introduce you to some folks." "That's very thoughtful of him," Florence replied, surprised by the small pang of disappointment she felt at missing him. "My brother's always been thoughtful," Abigail said with obvious pride. "Too thoughtful for his own good sometimes. Takes the weight of the whole town on his shoulders." After breakfast, Abigail guided Florence through Whitefish. The town was larger than Florence had initially thought, with a main street featuring a general store, bank, doctor's office, and several other establishments. People nodded politely as they passed, though Florence could feel their curious gazes following her. Their first stop was the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. Mrs. Palmer, a tiny woman with white hair and bent fingers, regarded Florence with sharp, intelligent eyes as she explained her teaching experience. "Boston educated, you say?" Mrs. Palmer adjusted her spectacles. "And you can handle arithmetic through algebra?" "Yes, madam, and geometry as well." Mrs. Palmer's expression softened. "Well, my dear, these old bones can't take much more of Montana winters. If the council approves, I'd be pleased to hand the reins to someone who knows what they're about." By mid-afternoon, Florence had met the Reverend, the doctor and his wife, and several prominent townspeople. Abigail's introduction seemed to carry weight, and most greeted her warmly, if with reserved curiosity. "Last stop," Abigail announced as they approached a modest building with a freshly painted sign reading Whitefish Gazette. "You'll want to meet Frank Wilson. He runs the newspaper and has the ear of everyone important in the county." The newspaper office was warm and smelled of ink and paper. A balding man in his 50s looked up from a printing press as they entered. "Abigail Rowland, twice in 1 month. To what do I owe the pleasure?" His eyes shifted to Florence with undisguised interest. "Frank, this is Miss Florence Keller from Boston. She's staying with me for the time being." Abigail launched into an abbreviated explanation of Florence's situation. Frank's expression grew serious as he listened. "Walter Green was a good man. Wrote a fine letter to the editor once about water rights." He turned to Florence. "Sorry for your troubles, Miss Keller. Though between you and me, you might have dodged a bullet. Walter was decent enough, but his ranch was more debt than profit these past few years." Florence blinked in surprise. "I wasn't aware. Few were. Man had his pride." Frank rifled through some papers on his desk. "I might be able to use some help around here if you've got a neat hand. Nothing permanent, mind you, but it could tide you over until something better comes along." "That's very kind, Mr. Wilson," Florence replied. "I'd be happy to help." As they left the newspaper office, Florence felt a small measure of hope. In just one day, she had potential opportunities for both temporary and permanent employment. Perhaps her impulsive journey west wouldn't end in disaster after all. They were halfway back to the boarding house when hoofbeats sounded on the packed snow of the main street. Marshall Rowland rode toward them, his expression grim. He dismounted in one fluid motion and secured his horse to a hitching post. "Abigail, Miss Keller," he nodded. "How was your tour of our little town?" "Quite enlightening," Florence replied. "Everyone has been very kind. Glad to hear it." Marshall's gaze softened briefly before turning serious again. "Abigail, I need to speak with the mayor." "Would you mind if Miss Keller accompanied me to the sheriff's office first? There's something I'd like to discuss with her." Abigail raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll head home and start supper. Don't keep her too long, the temperature's dropping again." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Florence sensed Marshall's tension. "Is something wrong, Sheriff Marshall?" he corrected automatically. He glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. "I rode out to Walter's ranch this morning. Wanted to check on the state of things, given your situation." Florence's heart quickened. And I found something unusual." He held the door of his office open for her, then followed her inside. The sheriff's office was plain but neat, with wanted posters lining one wall and a desk piled with papers. Marshall gestured for her to take a seat, then removed his hat and gloves before settling behind the desk. "Walter kept a journal," he said without preamble. "I found it in his desk." The last entry was dated 3 days before he took ill. Florence waited, uncertain where this was leading. Marshall opened a drawer and withdrew a leather-bound book. "I wouldn't normally read a man's private thoughts, but given the circumstances." He paused, then continued. "He wrote about you, Miss Keller." "Me?" Marshall nodded, opening the journal to a marked page. "He was looking forward to your arrival, had plans to expand the house come spring." His expression grew troubled. "But there's something else." The day before this entry, he'd received a visitor. A man claiming to represent the railroad company, offering to buy his land. Florence frowned. "Is that unusual?" "It is when no railroad has filed plans to build through this area." Marshall tapped the journal. "Walter refused the offer, said his land wasn't for sale at any price." He was suspicious enough that he wrote down a description of the man. "You think this has something to do with his death?" Marshall's eyes met hers. "The doctor said influenza, but Walter was healthy as a horse, never sick a day in his life, according to his neighbors." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down Florence's spine. "Are you suggesting he was murdered?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet." Marshall closed the journal. "But I find it strange that within a week of refusing to sell his land, Walter Green was dead, and now his mail-order bride shows up with no one expecting her. Surely you don't think I had anything to do with it?" Florence felt heat rising to her cheeks. Marshall's expression softened. "No, Miss Keller. I've seen enough liars in my time to recognize honesty when I see it, but I do think someone might not be pleased to learn you've arrived." "But why would anyone care about my presence?" "Because according to Walter's will, which I checked with the county clerk this afternoon, his property passes to his wife upon his death." Marshall leaned forward. "And while you never got the chance to marry him, your correspondence might be enough to challenge the will, especially since no other heirs have come forward." Florence sat back, stunned. "I never even met the man. I couldn't possibly claim his property." "Maybe not, but someone who wants that land might worry you'd try." Marshall's voice was grim. "Until I figure out what's going on, I think you should be careful about mentioning your connection to Walter Green." The implications settled over Florence like a heavy blanket. What had seemed like terrible luck arriving to find her prospective husband dead now took on a more sinister aspect. "What should I do?" she asked quietly. Marshall considered her for a moment. "Go about your business. Meet with the town council about the teaching position. Help Frank at the newspaper if he offers work. But keep your ears open and don't go wandering off alone. You really believe I might be in danger?" "I believe in being cautious." Marshall stood and moved around the desk, his tall frame casting a shadow in the late afternoon light. "This town is mostly good people, Miss Keller, but wherever there's land and money at stake, trouble tends to follow." Florence rose, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "Thank you for your honesty, Sheriff. I'll be vigilant." "Marshall," he corrected again, a hint of warmth returning to his eyes. "And I'll do the same. Nobody else is getting hurt on my watch." As they left the office, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of another snowfall. Florence tucked her hands into her muff, her mind racing with this new information. What had seemed like a tragic twist of fate now felt like something much more complicated and potentially dangerous. "I'll walk you back to Abigail's," Marshall said, offering his arm. Florence hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand on his sleeve. "Thank you." They walked in silence for a few moments before Florence spoke again. "Do you have suspects? People who might want Walter's land badly enough to—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. Marshall's jaw tightened. There are a few possibilities. Ernest Blackwood owns most of the valley already, been trying to buy up all the small ranches for years. Then there's the mining company from Helena that's been sniffing around, looking for copper deposits. What would they want with a cattle ranch? Water rights. Marshall nodded to a passing townsperson. Walter's property has the cleanest, most reliable creek in the county. In Montana, water is more valuable than gold sometimes. They reached Abigail's boarding house all too soon. Marshall paused at the gate, his expression serious. Council meeting is day after tomorrow at 4. I'll come escort you. That's not necessary, Florence protested. I can find my way. Humor me. His voice was quiet but firm. At least until I'm certain there's no connection between Walter's death and that mysterious railroad man. Florence studied his face, noting the genuine concern in his eyes. Very well, but please don't go to any special trouble on my account. A hint of a smile tugged at Marshall's lips. Miss Keller, looking out for the people of this town is never trouble. It's my duty. Something in his steady gaze made Florence's heart beat a little faster. Then I accept your escort, Sheriff Rowland. Marshall, he corrected one last time, tipping his hat before turning to leave. Good evening, Miss Keller. Florence watched him walk away, suddenly aware that her journey west had taken a turn she could never have anticipated. She had come seeking marriage to a man she'd never met. Instead, she found herself possibly in danger, with only a stern sheriff and his kind-hearted sister standing between her and an unknown threat. Yet somehow, as she entered the warm comfort of the boarding house, Florence felt less alone than she had in years. The following day brought heavy snow, trapping Florence indoors with Abigail and 3 other boarders, a young bank clerk, an elderly widow, and a traveling salesman waiting for the weather to clear. Florence used the time to mend her travel-worn clothing and prepare for her meeting with the town council. You've got nothing to worry about, Abigail assured her as they sat by the fire, needles flashing in the firelight. The council respects Marshall's judgment. If he says you're qualified to teach, they'll listen. I appreciate his support, Florence replied, carefully repairing a loose button on her best blouse. He seems very dedicated to this town. Abigail's eyes twinkled knowingly. My brother's always been that way. Takes after our father's strong sense of responsibility, makes him a fine sheriff, but it's hard on him sometimes. How so? He never takes time for himself. Abigail sighed. 34 years old and married to that badge. I've been trying to get him to court someone decent for years, but he always has some excuse. Florence felt her cheeks warm and focused intently on her sewing. Perhaps he's simply waiting for the right person. That's what he says. Abigail snorted softly. Meanwhile, every eligible woman in town has set her cap for him, and he barely notices. Before Florence could respond, the front door opened with a blast of cold air. Marshall stomped snow from his boots in the entryway before joining them in the sitting room. Ladies, he nodded, removing his hat. His dark hair was damp with melted snow and his cheeks ruddy from the cold. Quite a storm we're having. Sit by the fire before you catch your death, Abigail commanded. I'll fetch you some coffee. When Abigail had disappeared into the kitchen, Marshall turned to Florence. How are you settling in, Miss Keller? Well enough, thank you. She set aside her mending. Any news regarding your investigation? Marshall glanced toward the kitchen to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Nothing definitive. Blackwood was in Helena when Walter died, according to telegraph records. The mining company representatives haven't been seen in town for weeks, so it remains a mystery. For now. Marshall accepted the steaming cup Abigail brought him. But I did find something interesting. Walter's neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar tracks on the property line the day before Walter fell ill. Said they didn't belong to any local horse he recognized. Florence frowned. Could it have been this railroad representative you mentioned? Possibly. Marshall took a sip of coffee. I've sent inquiries to other counties asking if anyone's been approached about selling land for a railroad. Should hear back within a few days. Abigail, rejoining them, raised an eyebrow. Are you boring Miss Keller with sheriff business, Marshall? Not at all, Florence assured her. I find it quite fascinating. Marshall's eyes met hers over the rim of his cup, a silent understanding passing between them. He changed the subject smoothly. I've spoken with Mrs. Palmer again about the teaching position. She's quite impressed with your credentials. That's kind of her, Florence replied. I do hope the council feels the same. The conversation turned to town matters, with Abigail filling her brother in on the latest gossip. Florence listened attentively, trying to absorb as much as she could about the community that might become her home. After dinner, when Abigail was occupied with her other boarders, Marshall drew Florence aside in the hallway. I've been thinking about Walter's property, he said quietly. The land will likely go to auction if no heir claims it within 6 months. That's county law. I understand, Florence nodded. As I said, I wouldn't dream of making a claim. That's not what I'm suggesting. Marshall's voice was low. But whoever wanted that land badly enough to approach Walter might not know that. As long as they believe you could potentially inherit, you might be in danger. A chill ran down Florence's spine. What are you saying? I'm saying we might use that to our advantage. Marshall's eyes were intent. If we let it be known that you're considering your legal options regarding Walter's estate, it might flush out our mystery man. You want to use me as bait. Florence wasn't sure whether to be offended or impressed by his directness. I want to catch whoever might have had a hand in Walter's death, Marshall corrected, but I wouldn't ask you to take such a risk without protection. Florence considered his proposal. Part of her wanted nothing to do with such a scheme. She had come west for a fresh start, not to insert herself into a potential murder investigation. Yet another part, a part she hardly recognized, felt a surge of determination. If Walter Green had indeed been murdered, didn't she owe it to the man who had offered her a new life to help bring his killer to justice? What would this protection entail? She asked finally. You'd stay at my sister's boarding house, where I can keep an eye on you. You'd never go anywhere alone. Marshall's expression was grave. And if there's any sign of real danger, we abandon the plan immediately. Florence took a deep breath. Very well, I'll help you, Sheriff. Marshall, he corrected, the ghost of a smile crossing his features. And thank you, Miss Keller. Your courage is admirable. Florence, she replied. If we're to be conspirators in this plan, I think first names are appropriate. His smile widened slightly, transforming his stern features. Florence, then. The town council meeting the following afternoon proved less intimidating than Florence had anticipated. The council, consisting of the mayor, the bank president, Reverend Hopkins, Dr. Simmons, and a stern-faced rancher named Peterson, listened attentively as she outlined her qualifications and teaching philosophy. Boston methods might be a bit fancy for Montana children, Peterson commented gruffly. These youngsters need practical education. Reading, writing, ciphering. I assure you, Mr. Peterson, my approach is thoroughly practical, Florence replied confidently. But I believe even farm children deserve exposure to literature, history, and higher mathematics. Those who don't continue to higher education should still understand the world beyond Whitefish. Marshall, standing at the back of the room, gave her an approving nod. Mayor Jenkins, a portly man with an impressive mustache, cleared his throat. Mrs. Palmer speaks highly of you, Miss Keller, and we've been trying to convince her to retire for 2 years now. The position pays $30 a month, the bank president added, with living quarters above the schoolroom. It's modest, but it sounds perfectly adequate, Florence assured him. I would be honored to serve as your teacher. After a brief deliberation, the council voted unanimously to offer her the position, contingent upon Mrs. Palmer's final approval. Florence accepted graciously, hiding her relief behind a professional smile. With secure employment and housing, her precarious situation had stabilized considerably. As the meeting adjourned, Marshall approached. "Congratulations, Miss Keller." "Thank you, Sheriff." She smiled, conscious of the curious glances from council members. "If you're amenable, I'd like to show you something before we return to Abigail's," Marshall said, his voice carrying for the benefit of those nearby. "Walter Green's property. As the executor of county affairs, I thought you might want to see what might have been yours." Florence caught his meaning immediately and played along. "That's very thoughtful. I would appreciate seeing it." As they left the town hall, Marshall helped her into his wagon. "That should get tongues wagging," he murmured. "By nightfall, everyone in town will know you're interested in Walter's estate. And if our mysterious land seeker is watching, then we'll have set the hook." Marshall flicked the reins, setting the horses in motion. "I'm not actually taking you to Walter's ranch today, too far in this weather. But we'll ride out a ways to make the story convincing." As they traveled along the snow-packed road leading out of town, Florence found herself studying Marshall's profile. The strong line of his jaw, the watchful intensity of his eyes. Despite the seriousness of their situation, she felt oddly safe in his presence. "Tell me about yourself, Marshall," she said suddenly. "All I know is that you're the sheriff and Abigail's brother." He glanced at her, surprised. "Not much to tell. Born and raised in these parts. Fought in the war when I was barely 18. Came back and took up the badge 7 years ago when the previous sheriff retired." "The war," Florence calculated quickly. "You must have been very young." "Too young," he agreed grimly. "Saw things no boy should see. But it taught me the value of peace and order, which serves me well now." "And your family? Besides Abigail, I mean, just us now. Parents passed years back." Marshall guided the horses around a drift. "Father was a rancher, never wealthy, but we had enough. Mother taught us to read and write before we ever saw the inside of a schoolhouse." Florence smiled. "She sounds wonderful." She was. A warmth entered his voice. "Would have liked you, I think." She valued education highly. "And what about you, Marshall? What do you value?" He considered her question seriously. "Justice, honesty, loyalty." His eyes met hers briefly. "Community. A place where people look out for each other. Those are admirable values. And you?" he asked. "What brought a Boston schoolteacher to become a mail-order bride in Montana?" Florence looked out at the snow-covered landscape. "Opportunity, I suppose. Teaching positions for women in Boston are becoming scarce, and the pay barely covers living expenses. My parents died 3 years ago, leaving little behind. When I saw Walter's advertisement..." She trailed off, then continued more softly. "He wrote beautiful letters, described the land with such passion, said he wanted a partner, not just a housekeeper. It seemed hopeful." Marshall nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Walter was a decent man, would have treated you right." "I believe he would have." Florence sighed. "It seems cruel that I arrived too late even to meet him." They had reached a rise overlooking a valley. Marshall stopped the wagon and set the brake. "That's Walter's land down there," he said, pointing to a distant cluster of buildings nestled against a creek. "Not the biggest spread, but good water, good grazing. He built it all himself over 15 years. Florence gazed at the property, trying to imagine the life she might have had there. It looked peaceful, surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Yes, it is." Marshall wasn't looking at the land. Florence felt her cheeks warm despite the cold air. She turned back to the view. "Who would inherit if I made no claim?" "County would auction it off to cover any debts, with remaining proceeds going to the territorial government." Marshall frowned. "Blackwood would likely snap it up. He's been buying all the small ranches that come available." "This Ernest Blackwood sounds quite the empire builder." "That's one way to put it." Marshall's voice hardened. "Another would be land grabber. Uses every trick in the book to pressure people into selling. Nothing illegal I can prove, but not honorable either." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the snow. "We should head back," Marshall said finally. "Temperature's dropping." As they turned toward town, Florence couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw only empty road behind them. "Something wrong?" Marshall asked, noticing her movement. "Just a strange feeling." She shook her head. "Imagination, I'm sure." Marshall's hand moved subtly to rest on the revolver at his hip. "Never discount your instincts. They keep you alive out here." The ride back to town was tense, both of them scanning the surrounding terrain for signs of followers. They saw nothing unusual, but Marshall remained vigilant until they reached the boarding house. "Stay inside tonight," he advised as he helped her down from the wagon. "I'll have Deputy Foster keep an eye on the house, just in case." "Do you really think someone would make a move so quickly?" "I don't know." Marshall's expression was grim. "But if Walter's death wasn't natural, we're dealing with someone desperate. And desperate men do desperate things." Florence slept poorly that night, startling at every creak of the old house. By morning, exhaustion had left dark circles under her eyes, which Abigail noticed immediately at breakfast. "You look like you've seen a ghost, dear," she commented, pouring coffee. "Bad dreams." "Just restless," Florence replied. "Perhaps I'm still adjusting to the altitude." "Or perhaps it's my brother keeping you awake with his wild theories," Abigail said shrewdly. "He told me about your plan. Can't say I approve of using you as bait." Florence sighed. "It was my choice, Abigail. If someone did harm Walter Green, they should face justice." "Justice won't do you much good if you're dead too," Abigail muttered. "Marshall's too caught up in being sheriff sometimes to remember people aren't pieces on a chessboard." Before Florence could defend Marshall, the man himself entered the kitchen, looking as tired as she felt. "Morning," he nodded, accepting the coffee Abigail thrust at him. "Any trouble overnight?" "Not a peep," Abigail replied, "though Florence looks like she barely slept." Marshall's concerned gaze fell on Florence. "Are you having second thoughts? We can call this off." "No," Florence said firmly. "I want to help, but perhaps we should accelerate matters. The sooner we identify our mysterious land seeker, the sooner this will be resolved." Marshall considered her suggestion. "What did you have in mind?" "A more public declaration of my interest in Walter's property." Florence's mind raced ahead. Perhaps an announcement in Mr. Wilson's newspaper, or a formal inquiry at the county office. Marshall's eyes lit with approval. "Both good ideas. Let's start with Wilson. He loves a good story, and news of a potential inheritance dispute would sell papers." After breakfast, they walked to the newspaper office, where Frank Wilson greeted them with undisguised curiosity. "Sheriff, Miss Keller, what brings you by so early?" Marshall explained their purpose, carefully framing it as Florence's legitimate inquiry into her potential rights as Walter's intended bride. Wilson's journalistic instincts perked up immediately. "Fascinating situation," he mused, scribbling notes. "Don't recall a case quite like it before." "Mail-order bride arrives to find her groom deceased. Does she have legal claim to his estate?" Makes for compelling reading. "I'm not certain I have any claim," Florence clarified. "But given our correspondence and my journey here at Walter's invitation, I believe it's worth investigating." Of course," Wilson nodded eagerly. "I could run a front-page story in tomorrow's edition. Boston lady seeks justice in frontier inheritance case or some such." "That seems a bit sensational," Florence protested. "Newspapers thrive on sensation, Miss Keller." Wilson winked. "But I'll be factual, I promise, just with a touch of drama to ensure it's widely read." As they left the newspaper office, Marshall seemed satisfied. "That should draw attention. Wilson's paper circulates throughout the county." "What now?" Florence asked. "Now we wait." Marshall offered his arm as they navigated an icy patch of sidewalk. "And we keep our eyes open for any unusual response." They didn't have to wait long. By that afternoon, Florence had received 3 visitors at the boarding house, all ostensibly offering condolences and assistance, but clearly fishing for information about her intentions regarding Walter's property. The most interesting visitor, however, arrived just before supper. A well-dressed man with a diamond stickpin in his cravat introduced himself as Samuel Porter, representative of the Montana Land Development Company. "Miss Keller," he bowed slightly as Abigail showed him into the parlor where Florence waited. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, though the circumstances are unfortunate." "Mr. Porter," Florence nodded, gesturing to a chair. "How may I help you?" Porter settled himself comfortably. "I understand you're investigating a potential claim to the late Mr. Green's property." "News travels quickly," Florence observed. "Small communities," Porter smiled thinly. "My company had business dealings with Mr. Green before his untimely passing. We had made an offer on his land quite generous, I might add, which he was considering." Florence's pulse quickened. This matched the mysterious visitor Marshall had mentioned finding in Walter's journal. "Is that so? I wasn't aware Walter was planning to sell." "Oh yes," Porter nodded confidently. "In fact, we were quite close to an agreement when this unfortunate influenza struck him down." "How curious." Florence maintained a pleasant expression. "His neighbor mentioned nothing about Walter's intention to sell when the sheriff and I visited the property yesterday." Porter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Neighbors often know less than they think. Business matters tend to be private." "Of course." Florence sipped the tea Abigail had provided. "What sort of development does your company engage in, Mr. Porter?" "Various interests. Primarily land acquisition for Eastern investors." Porter leaned forward. "Miss Keller, while your situation is unfortunate, it also presents an opportunity. If you are granted any rights to Green's property, my company would be prepared to make you an extremely attractive offer, far more than you would receive at county auction." "That's very interesting." Florence set down her cup. "I would need to consult with Sheriff Rowland, of course. He's been advising me on legal matters." Porter's smile tightened. "The sheriff is a dedicated lawman, I'm sure, but business dealings might be outside his expertise." "Perhaps." Florence rose, signaling the end of the conversation. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Porter. I'll certainly consider it if my claim proves valid." "Don't consider too long," Porter advised, his tone hardening slightly as he stood. "Opportunities like this have a way of evaporating quickly." After Porter departed, Florence immediately sent Abigail's young helper to fetch Marshall. When he arrived 20 minutes later, she recounted the conversation in detail. "Railroad representative, indeed," Marshall muttered when she finished. "Montana Land Development Company is a shell for mining interests. They've been buying up water rights all through the territory." "He implied Walter was ready to sell," Florence added, "but from what you found in the journal, Walter refused him outright." Marshall paced the small parlor. "And this thread about opportunities evaporating quickly, I don't like it. Nor do I." Florence shivered despite the warm room. "What do we do now?" Marshall stopped pacing and faced her. "We spring the trap. Let's have Wilson run that story tomorrow, announcing you're formally pursuing a claim to Walter's estate. Then we watch Porter very carefully. And if he's dangerous, then he'll have to get through me first." Marshall's voice was steel. The next morning, the Whitefish Gazette featured a front-page story exactly as promised. Wilson had outdone himself with the headline, "Boston Bride Claims Frontier Ranch. Eastern School Teacher Seeks Late Fiancé's Estate." The article detailed Florence's arrival, her correspondence with Walter, and her intention to file formal papers with the territorial court regarding her potential rights to his property. While factually accurate in broad strokes, Wilson had embellished liberally, painting Florence as a determined Eastern lady fighting for frontier justice. "This should certainly get attention," Florence commented as she and Marshall read the paper over breakfast. "Too much attention," Abigail muttered, refilling coffee cups. "I don't like this one bit." Marshall ignored his sister's concern. "I've arranged for you to meet with Judge Harmon this afternoon. He handles estate matters for the county. It's just for show, but it will make your claim seem more serious. And hopefully draw out our mysterious Mr. Porter," Florence added. "That's the idea." Marshall folded the newspaper. "In the meantime, I've asked Deputy Foster to keep an eye on Porter. He checked into the hotel 2 days ago, claiming to be here on mining business." Florence's meeting with Judge Harmon went smoothly. The elderly judge seemed doubtful of her legal standing, but agreed to review the correspondence between her and Walter. As they left the county offices, Marshall spotted Porter watching from across the street. "Don't look now, but our friend is taking an interest in your legal affairs," he murmured. Florence resisted the urge to turn. "What's our next move? We give him something to worry about." Marshall raised his voice slightly as they passed a group of townspeople. "Judge Harmon seemed quite sympathetic, Miss Keller. I believe your claim has merit." That evening, Florence retired early, exhausted from the tension of the day. Marshall had arranged for Deputy Foster to watch the boarding house overnight, allowing him to follow Porter's movements. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her as she wondered what developments the next day might bring. A soft tapping at her window startled her fully awake. Florence sat up, heart pounding as the tapping came again. Cautiously, she approached the window and pulled back the curtain. Marshall's face peered back at her from the darkness. He gestured for her to open the window. With trembling fingers, Florence unlatched the window and pushed it up. Cold air rushed in as Marshall's urgent whisper followed. "Get dressed quickly. Bring only what you absolutely need." "What's happened?" Florence whispered back, alarmed by his intensity. "Porter met with 2 men at the saloon tonight. They rode out of town an hour ago, heading toward Walter's ranch." Marshall's eyes were hard in the moonlight. "I think they're planning to destroy evidence. We need to get there first. Shouldn't you bring the deputy? No time, and Foster's watching the boarding house." Marshall glanced over his shoulder. 5 minutes. Meet me at the back door." The window closed and Florence scrambled to dress in her warmest clothes. She stuffed a few essentials into a small bag, pulled on her boots and coat, and made her way silently down the back stairs. Marshall waited with 2 saddled horses. "Ever ridden before?" "Not since I was a girl," Florence admitted. "Stay close to me. We'll take it slow, but we need to move." He helped her mount, then swung easily into his own saddle. "It's about 5 miles to Walter's ranch. With the moon, we should make good time." They rode in tense silence, following a trail that wound through snow-covered pines. Florence's muscles protested the unfamiliar activity, but she gritted her teeth against the discomfort. Whatever Marshall had discovered must be serious indeed to warrant this midnight ride. "There," Marshall pointed finally, slowing his horse. Through the trees, Florence could make out the dark shapes of buildings against the snow. "We'll approach on foot from here. Less chance of being heard." They dismounted, securing the horses to a tree. Marshall removed his rifle from its scabbard and checked it before motioning for Florence to follow. They moved cautiously through the trees until they reached the edge of a clearing. Walter Green's ranch lay peaceful in the moonlight. A small cabin, a barn, and several outbuildings formed a rough courtyard. No lights showed in any window and no horses were visible. "We beat them here," Marshall whispered. "The barn is our best bet. If Walter hid anything incriminating, it would be there." They crossed the open space quickly, staying low. At the barn door, Marshall paused to listen before easing it open. Inside, the smell of hay and old leather filled the air. Marshall struck a match, lighting a small lantern he found hanging near the door. "What exactly are we looking for?" Florence asked, keeping her voice low. "I'm not sure." Marshall held the lantern high, illuminating the barn's interior. "Walter mentioned a strongbox in his journal, said he kept important papers there." They searched methodically, checking beneath floorboards and behind stacked hay bales. Florence was beginning to lose hope when Marshall's quiet exclamation drew her attention. "Here." He was kneeling beside a loose board in the corner. As Florence watched, he pried it up to reveal a metal box. This must be it. Before he could open it, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Marshall immediately extinguished the lantern. "They're here," he whispered. "Take the box and hide in the loft. Don't make a sound no matter what happens." "I can't leave you, Florence." His voice was urgent but gentle. "I need you safe, please." Something in his tone convinced her. Florence took the heavy box and scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, while Marshall moved to position himself near the barn door, rifle ready. From her hiding place, Florence could see through a crack between boards as 3 riders approached. They dismounted near the cabin, their voices carrying in the still night. "Check the house first," ordered a familiar voice, Samuel Porter. "Then the barn. We need to find that strongbox." "And if we run into trouble?" asked a gruff voice. "Handle it," Porter replied coldly. "Green's woman is getting too close. This ends tonight." Florence's blood ran cold. These men had come prepared to kill if necessary, perhaps had already killed once. Below, she could see Marshall tense, shifting to better cover the door while remaining hidden in shadow. 2 men entered the cabin while Porter remained outside, nervously scanning the surroundings. Minutes later they emerged. "Nothing inside," one reported. "Place looks untouched since Green died." "Try the barn," Porter ordered, "and be careful, something doesn't feel right." As the 2 men approached the barn, Florence held her breath. Marshall had positioned himself perfectly. He would have clear shots if necessary. But he was outnumbered, and Porter remained by the cabin, out of range. The barn door creaked open. 1 man entered, lantern held high, while the other followed with a drawn revolver. Florence could see Marshall waiting, absolutely still, as the men moved further inside. "Look there," the first man said suddenly. "Footprints in the dust. Someone's been here." Before the second man could respond, Marshall's voice rang out. "Drop your weapons. You're under arrest." Instead of complying, both men whirled toward the sound. The one with the revolver fired blindly in Marshall's direction. The shot went wide, splintering wood near Florence's hiding place. Marshall's return fire was more accurate. The gunman cried out and fell, clutching his arm. The second man dropped his lantern and bolted for the door. Outside, Porter shouted, "What's happening?" Then fired several shots toward the barn. "Florence, stay down." Marshall called as he moved to secure the wounded man. But Florence had already opened the strongbox. Inside, she found letters, land deeds, and a journal different from the one Marshall had found in the house. Flipping it open, She scanned the pages by moonlight, her eyes widening at what she read. Marshall had tied the wounded man and was preparing to pursue Porter and his fleeing accomplice when Florence called down. "Marshall, Walter knew they were trying to kill him." "What?" He looked up, momentarily distracted. "It's all here." Florence held up the journal. Porter offered to buy his land 3 times. When Walter refused, Porter threatened him. The last entry says he suspected they poisoned his well. Outside, the sound of galloping horses indicated Porter and his companion were fleeing. Marshall hesitated, torn between pursuit and the evidence Florence had found. "Bring it down," he decided. "This is more important." Florence descended carefully, clutching the box. As she reached the ground, the wounded man groaned. Porter said, "No witnesses," he gasped. "Paid us to burn the place, with the woman inside." Marshall's expression hardened. "You're looking at attempted murder charges. Maybe worse if we can prove you were involved in Walter Green's death." "Wasn't me," the man insisted. "Porter. He put something in Green's whiskey when he visited. Said it would look like sickness." Florence felt sick. "They murdered him because he wouldn't sell his land. Water rights," the man muttered. "Worth a fortune to the mining operation." Marshall secured the prisoner to a support beam. "I need to go after Porter. He can't get away with this." "I'll come with you," Florence said firmly. "Too dangerous." "I'll stay with the prisoner," she countered. "But you can't leave me here alone and go chasing armed men in the dark. That's a recipe for disaster." Marshall knew she was right. "Fine, we'll wait until morning. Deputy Foster will realize something's wrong when he can't find either of us. He'll bring help." They spent a tense night in the barn, taking turns watching the prisoner and keeping an eye on the surrounding area in case Porter returned with reinforcements. As dawn broke, they heard the welcome sound of approaching horses, Deputy Foster and several armed townsmen. "Marshall," Foster called. "You in there?" "Here," Marshall replied, opening the barn door. "We've got a prisoner and evidence of murder." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Porter was captured attempting to board a train in Helena, and his accomplice turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The territorial prosecutor arrived to take statements and collect evidence, including the damning journal entries and the confession of Porter's hired gun. Analysis of samples from Walter's well confirmed the presence of arsenic, and a search of Porter's hotel room uncovered a small vial of the poison. The case against him was overwhelming. Throughout the investigation, Florence remained at Marshall's side, providing testimony and helping organize the evidence. Their midnight adventure had cemented a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. A week after the arrests, with Porter and his accomplices safely behind bars awaiting trial, Marshall found Florence at the schoolhouse. Mrs. Palmer had officially retired, and Florence was preparing the classroom for her first day of teaching. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Florence looked up from arranging books on shelves. "Nearly. I'm a bit nervous, to be honest. These children don't know me yet. They'll love you." Marshall stepped inside, removing his hat. "You've already won over the entire town with your courage." Florence blushed. "I merely did what anyone would do." "No," Marshall shook his head. "Most people would have taken the first train east after learning their intended husband had died. You stayed. You helped bring his killers to justice." "I couldn't have done it without you," she pointed out. Marshall moved closer, his usual reserve softening. "Judge Harmon had an interesting suggestion today about Walter's property." "Oh," Florence set down the book she was holding. "Since the evidence proves Walter was murdered because he refused to sell, and since you were his intended bride, the judge believes a case could be made for you to inherit the ranch." Marshall watched her reaction carefully. It would require a territorial court ruling, but with the circumstances being so unusual, Florence was stunned. But I never even met Walter. Surely there must be more deserving heirs. None have come forward. Marshall took another step closer. The judge feels it would be a fitting justice. Walter wanted you to share his life and his land. In a way, this would honor his wishes. I don't know the first thing about running a ranch, Florence protested. You could sell it, or lease it out. Marshall hesitated, then added quietly, or you could find someone who knows ranching to help you run it. The implication hung in the air between them. Florence studied his face, seeing past the stern sheriff to the man beneath honorable, kind, and increasingly dear to her. Someone like you. She asked softly. Marshall's eyes held hers. I've been thinking, Florence, about what Abigail's always saying, that I'm married to this badge. And she's not entirely wrong. He reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. But these past weeks, working with you, getting to know you, it's made me realize there might be room in my life for more than just being sheriff. Florence's heart quickened. Marshall, I know it's too soon, he said quickly. You came here expecting to marry one man, and it would be presumptuous of me to— Florence stepped forward and placed her fingers gently against his lips, stopping his words. I came here seeking a new life, Marshall, with someone honorable and kind. I believe I may have found that, just not in the way I expected. Marshall's hand came up to capture hers, holding it against his chest. I don't have fine words like Walter did. I'm not a poet or a scholar. I don't need poetry, Florence replied. I need honesty, loyalty, justice. She smiled. The things you value. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Marshall lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Florence responded. When they finally parted, both were breathing unevenly. I should probably have asked permission first, Marshall murmured, still holding her close. Consider it granted, Florence replied, her cheeks flushed, both retroactively and for future reference. Marshall's laugh was low and warm. I'll remember that. As winter melted into spring, Florence established herself as Whitefish's schoolteacher. The children responded well to her combination of high expectations and genuine care, and even Mr. Peterson admitted that her Boston methods seemed to be working just fine. The territorial court ruled in her favor regarding Walter's property, citing the extraordinary circumstances and clear evidence that his death had been orchestrated to prevent him from passing the land to her. The ruling was controversial in some quarters, but most of the town supported the decision, seeing it as justice for a good man taken too soon. Florence decided to keep the ranch, leasing most of the grazing land to neighboring ranchers while maintaining the house and immediate surroundings. With Marshall's help, she hired a reliable foreman to oversee the day-to-day operations. Their courtship progressed steadily through the spring and summer. Marshall remained dedicated to his duties as sheriff, but found time to escort Florence to church socials, town meetings, and quiet rides through the mountains. Abigail watched their growing relationship with undisguised satisfaction, pointedly mentioning at every opportunity how much their mother would have approved. On a warm evening in late August, Marshall took Florence on a picnic to the overlook where he had first shown her Walter's ranch, now her ranch. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the valley in gold and crimson, he knelt before her. Florence Keller, he said, his deep voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. When you arrived in Whitefish that cold December day, I promised you weren't forgotten. I meant it then as a lawman's duty. But now, he took her hands in his. Now I'm asking if you'll allow me to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel forgotten or alone again. Tears filled Florence's eyes as Marshall continued. I love you, Florence. Your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. I'm asking if you'll do me the honor of becoming my wife." "Yes," she whispered, her heart too full for more elaborate speech. "Yes, Marshall." Their wedding took place on the first anniversary of Florence's arrival in Whitefish. The entire town turned out for the celebration, held in the church where Florence now played the organ each Sunday. Abigail wept openly as her brother and new sister-in-law exchanged vows, and even the crusty Mr. Peterson was seen dabbing at his eyes during the ceremony. After a brief honeymoon in Helena, they returned to Whitefish to begin their life together. At Marshall's insistence, they made their home at Walter's, now Florence's, ranch, with Marshall riding into town each day to fulfill his sheriff's duties. Florence continued teaching, dividing her time between the schoolhouse and improving their home. When winter returned and snow once again blanketed the Montana landscape, Florence often thought back to that cold day at the train station. How desperate and alone she had felt, how uncertain her future had seemed. Then Marshall had appeared, offering his hand and his promise. "You're not forgotten." He had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. And on cold mornings when he held her close before riding into town, or quiet evenings when they sat by the fire discussing the day's events, or in the secret darkness of night when their love found physical expression, Florence knew with absolute certainty that she had found what she'd traveled west seeking: not just a husband, but a true partner and a place to belong. 5 years later, as spring returned to the mountains, Florence sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching Marshall teaching their 3-year-old son, Walter, how to gently pet a new foal. Their infant daughter, Margaret, slept peacefully in her cradle nearby, her tiny features a perfect blend of her parents'. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. The water rights that had nearly cost Walter green, his life now supported not just their own cattle but irrigation projects that benefited the entire community. Marshall still served as sheriff, respected throughout the territory for his fairness and integrity. Florence had trained a younger woman to take over most of her teaching duties, allowing her to focus on her family and her increasingly successful efforts to establish a proper library for Whitefish. As she watched her husband lift their laughing son onto his shoulders, Florence reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. She had arrived as a mail-order bride for one man, only to find unexpected love with another. What had begun in loss and danger had transformed into a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. Marshall looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still rare in public but freely given to his family, warmed her heart as it had since those first tense days of their acquaintance. He said something to Walter, then walked toward her, their son still perched securely on his shoulders. "What are my favorite people doing?" he asked, bending carefully to kiss her. "Admiring the view," Florence replied, reaching up to tickle Walter, who giggled and squirmed. "Happy?" Marshall asked quietly, the simple question carrying layers of meaning between them. Florence thought of the frightened, abandoned woman she had been that winter day, and of all that had happened since: the danger, the adventure, the growth, the love. She thought of the community that had embraced her, the family they had built, and the future stretching before them. "Completely," she answered, taking his free hand in hers. "And never forgotten."